The world of ancient Rome often dazzles us with images of grandeur, towering temples, marble statues that seemed to breathe, and a city that called itself eternal. But beneath the gilded facade of empire, there were stories of cruelty so chilling that even the strongest hearts falter when they are retold. Among the most haunting were the fates reserved for the Vestal Virgins, the sacred guardians of the Temple of Vesta, whose eternal flame was believed to safeguard the very survival of Rome. To betray that flame, or worse, to betray the vows that bound them, was seen not merely as a crime against society, but as an offense against the gods themselves. And for such violations, punishments were devised that stripped away every layer of human dignity. The Vestals were chosen as little girls, often no more than 6 or 7 years old, plucked from their families and consecrated to the goddess. Their charge was a lifetime of chastity, discipline, and service. In exchange, they were afforded privileges unheard of for women in Rome's: status, property, influence, and the ability to walk free of a man's control. But privilege carried its price. If a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, punishment was swift and merciless. For Rome believed that the slightest impurity could invite divine wrath upon the empire. And in Rome's darkest traditions, punishment was never designed for correction. It was designed for spectacle, for terror, for making an example of those who dared to defy the sacred order. The first punishment that stands out is perhaps the cruelest in its deceptive gentleness: being buried alive. Imagine it: one of the most honored women in Rome, carried through the streets in solemn silence, surrounded by priests, magistrates, and citizens who dared not speak her name. She would be dressed in her sacred garments, veiled, her hands bound not with chains but with the invisible weight of shame. Rome, in its twisted sense of piety, would not allow her blood to be spilled, for that too was a pollution. So they created a ritual of slow death disguised as mercy. At the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness, a small underground chamber was prepared, a narrow room with a bed, a lamp, a little food and water. The idea was that the gods, not men, would decide her fate. But everyone knew what it meant. The earth would swallow her, silence would wrap around her, and within days the sacred virgin would wither in darkness, her cries unheard. This ritual was not a hidden cruelty. It was performed as a public drama, with the Senate, the pontiffs, and the crowd all bearing witness. And here lies the horror: a people convinced of their own righteousness, offering a young woman as a living sacrifice in order to reassure themselves that their empire remained favored by the divine. What Rome called justice was, in truth, a theater of suffering. The sacred virgin became both victim and scapegoat, her body imprisoned as her name was erased, so that Rome could pretend its purity was restored. But burial alive was not the only fate. Sometimes, Rome's punishments took on a brutality that stripped away even the illusion of piety. There are accounts of Vestals accused not merely of impurity but of treasonous conspiracies. Women caught in the crossfire of politics, where their chastity became a weapon to destroy reputations. For them, execution could take the form of public flogging to death. To strike a Vestal was itself considered sacrilege, but Rome found ways to justify it when the accusation was grave enough. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's high priest, would oversee the ordeal. The sacred virgin would be beaten with rods, her cries echoing in the forum, her body shattered until breath no longer came. It was not merely punishment, but ritual humiliation. a message to all that no one, not even the guardians of Rome's flame, stood above the iron grip of law and tradition. Imagine the scene. The crowd gathered, some averting their eyes, others watching with grim fascination. The sound of wood against flesh, the slow breaking of a body meant to embody divine purity. For the Vestal herself, the pain was not only physical, it was the knowledge that every strike was erasing her sanctity, turning her from a chosen daughter of the goddess into a warning post for generations to come. Rome called it justice, but it was vengeance disguised as piety. A society terrified of its own fragility, punishing its daughters to soothe its fears. And then there was the most humiliating punishment of all, the public shaming before execution. For a Vestal accused of impurity, the crime was seen not only as betrayal of Rome but as a stain upon her own body. She was often paraded through the streets, her sacred veil torn from her head, her hair shorn as though she were a criminal slave. To strip a woman of her hair in Rome was to strip her of identity, honor, and dignity. It was a symbolic death before the physical one. The people watched as the woman who once walked in honor and respect was dragged through dirt and scorn. Children pointed, elders whispered, soldiers sneered. She was no longer a guardian of the flame, no longer a bridge between Rome and the gods. She was reduced to a symbol of disgrace. And only then, once she had been broken in spirit, would she be led to her final fate, whether burial, flogging, or worse. What makes these punishments unbearable to recount is not only the pain but the profound loneliness that each Vestal endured. They were taken as children, raised in silence and discipline, given honor but stripped of choice. And when condemned, they stood utterly alone, no family to defend them, no husband to plead for mercy, no children to cry for their release. Rome demanded their isolation, demanded that they suffer in silence, demanded that their voices vanish beneath the weight of ritual. And in that silence, we can almost hear the deeper truth. A society that celebrated its glory through the sacrifice of its daughters, convincing itself that cruelty was holiness. The story of the Vestals is often told as one of privilege, but when you peel back the marble layers, you find a chilling reminder of how power can consume innocence. These women were not merely punished, they were erased. Their bodies became offerings, their suffering a performance staged for the survival of empire. And in that performance, we see a reflection of every society that has justified cruelty in the name of order. Every empire that has demanded the silence of women to maintain its illusion of strength. Rome's punishments for its sacred virgins reveal the darkest paradox of civilization. That the same culture, capable of philosophy, architecture, and law, could also bury its daughters alive, could also turn ritual into torture, could also shroud injustice in the name of the divine. To remember these women is not only to remember their pain, but to confront the ways in which dignity can be stripped away when fear governs justice. Their story is not only ancient Rome's story, it is the story of humanity's struggle to honor its most vulnerable, and the cost when we fail. The fate of the Vestal Virgins did not end with their deaths. In fact, their punishments lived on in whispers. In the heavy silence of Roman households, in the trembling voices of mothers who warned their daughters of what it meant to live under the gaze of empire. The horror was not only the cruelty itself, but the way Rome justified it, as if the destruction of a woman's body could cleanse the sins of a nation. And when we look closely, what we see is not divine justice but human fear, disguised in ritual, Rome was obsessed with purity. The flame that burned in the temple of Vesta symbolized the empire's eternal life, and the Vestals were its guardians. If the flame went out, or if one of the virgins was accused of betrayal, it was not treated as a mere lapse of duty. It was seen as a crack in Rome's destiny, a dangerous omen that the gods were withdrawing their favor. So the empire sought to seal those cracks with punishment, to cover fear with blood, and to convince the people that order had been restored. Yet beneath that order was a different truth. A society built on the suffering of women, willing to bury innocence alive to preserve the myth of strength. One of the most haunting aspects of these punishments was their deliberate ritualization. Rome could have simply executed the accused in private, but it chose instead to make punishment a spectacle. The burial alive of a Vestal was not done in a corner. It was a ceremony. The flogging of a sacred virgin was not carried out in secret. It was a performance. The public humiliation of shaving her head and tearing her garments was staged before the eyes of citizens who were taught that their survival depended on watching another human being's dignity destroyed. And here lies the profound cruelty. These punishments did not merely end lives, they reshaped memory. Once condemned, a Vestal ceased to exist as a person in the eyes of Rome. She was transformed into a symbol of disorder, a warning, an object lesson for future generations. Her family was disgraced, her name erased from records, her memory reduced to whispers of shame. It was not enough to kill her. Rome demanded that she be forgotten, buried not only in earth but in silence. Yet silence has a way of carrying echoes. Though the empire sought to erase these women, their stories still reach us across centuries, not because Rome preserved them, but because human memory refuses to let injustice vanish. And when we listen to those echoes, we begin to see the deeper pattern. How power uses ritual to disguise cruelty. How societies justify stripping dignity from the vulnerable in order to preserve an illusion of order. If we strip away the marble and Latin words, the story of the Vestals feels painfully familiar. Across time and cultures, women have borne the weight of society's fears. When order is threatened, it is often the bodies of women that are turned into battlegrounds, punished in ways meant to terrify, to humiliate, to silence. The ritual of shaving a Vestal's head before execution has echoes in countless cultures where women accused of betrayal are stripped of hair, dignity, and humanity. The burial alive of a sacred virgin mirrors the countless ways societies have buried women in silence, in prisons, in exile. And the public floggings remind us of every time violence was justified as discipline, every time cruelty was called protection. The story of Rome's sacred virgins also forces us to confront a disturbing paradox: how a society can be both enlightened and brutal at once. Rome gave us laws, roads, literature, architecture, yet it also gave us spectacles of death that relied on the suffering of the powerless. It reminds us that progress in one area does not erase cruelty in another, that a civilization can be brilliant in art and monstrous in justice. And perhaps that is the hardest truth to accept, that greatness and cruelty can coexist, that beauty and brutality often share the same stage. But if we stop here, the story remains only one of despair. And these women deserve more than despair. They deserve remembrance. They deserve to be seen not merely as victims, but as human beings whose suffering reveals something urgent about our own humanity. To retell their stories is to push back against the silence Rome demanded, to restore the dignity that was stolen from them. Imagine, for a moment, the perspective of one of these women in her final hours. She was chosen as a child, honored by the state, told that her life had meaning only in service to the goddess. She may never have asked for that destiny, but she embraced it because she had no choice. Then, one day, she was accused, perhaps truthfully, perhaps falsely, for accusations were often tangled in politics. She stood before the Pontifex Maximus, the guardians of law, and the people of Rome, knowing that her words meant nothing, that her silence meant everything, that her life was already lost. What does it mean to face death, not as an individual, but as a symbol, punished not for who you are, but for what you represent? That is the question her story leaves for us. And as we ponder that question, we begin to see how her fate resonates beyond Rome. It resonates in the lives of those who have been punished not for their crimes, but for their identity, not for their actions, but for the fears they stirred in others. It resonates in the stories of the enslaved, the colonized, the silenced. It resonates in the history of Black life across centuries, where justice was twisted into spectacle, where punishment was public, ritualized, and designed not only to destroy the body, but to strip away dignity. The Vestal Virgins remind us that injustice, when sanctified by ritual, becomes harder to resist, because it wears the mask of holiness. Rome told itself it was preserving order. Societies throughout history have told themselves they were preserving purity, protecting tradition, defending the sacred. Yet, in every case, the cost was measured in human suffering, in voices silenced, in lives cut short. To tell this story today is to refuse the silence that Rome demanded. It is to remember the women who were buried alive, the women who were flogged, the women whose hair was shorn and whose dignity was stolen. It is to say that their pain was not meaningless, that their suffering was not erased, that we can learn from their fate, if we dare to look honestly at the ways power disguises cruelty. Because in the end, the story of Rome's sacred virgins is not only a story about Rome, it is a story about USA, about how we treat the vulnerable, about how we define justice, about how easily fear can twist into ritual cruelty. Their silence calls out across centuries, asking us whether we will repeat Rome's mistakes, or whether we will finally break the cycle of cruelty disguised as order. The eternal flame of Vesta may have long since been extinguished, but the memory of those women still burns. And if we listen closely, it is not the silence of the grave that we hear, it is a voice whispering through history, a voice that says, "Dignity is sacred, and to destroy it is the greatest crime of all."